Time. Question number 9, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Trade and asks, will New Zealand follow Australia and refuse to sign up to the investor-state dispute provisions of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement? If not, why not?
The Honourable Tim Grosser.
Mr. Speaker, the New Zealand Government will obviously make up its own mind about what it signs and what it doesn't sign at the end of this negotiation, when all the facts are on the table, when and if the TPP negotiation reaches a successful conclusion.
Dr. Russell Norman.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, Dr. Russell Norman.
My question wasn't whether New Zealand would make up its own mind. I'm sure it will. My question was, will New Zealand refuse to sign up to the investor-state disputes mechanism?
Order. I know, I accept my eyesight's not great without my glasses, but if I see the question, it says, will New Zealand follow Australia and refuse to sign? And that the Minister answered that. Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Why is his government willing and open to signing an investor-state dispute provisions in this trade agreement when Australia refuses to do so because, as they say, these provisions constrain the ability of Australian governments to make laws on social, environmental and economic matters?
The Honourable Tim Grosser.
Mr. Speaker, I can assure the House that the government will sign an agreement that makes sense, and that agreement will be following very carefully the very sensible provisions that the previous government, aided by the same advisers who are advising me as the Minister, for clauses that will protect New Zealand from illegitimate use of such a clause.
The Honourable Clayton Cosgrove.
The Minister, can I take it from that answer for clarity that he will assure the House that any concluded TPPA will include safeguard provisions which will protect New Zealand's sovereignty, similar to those Labor negotiated as part of the China FTA, which ensures New Zealand can legislate and regulate for the public good?
The Honourable Tim Grosser.
Absolutely.
Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Why is the New Zealand government and the previous government so confident that they can negotiate clauses that will protect their ability to make laws on social, environmental and economic matters when the Australian federal government has made a very clear statement that they believe that is not possible with investor-state disputes mechanisms, and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade of the Australian federal government has made exactly the same statement?
The Honourable Tim Grosser.
Because I have great confidence in the professional ability of our negotiators, and our negotiators on the question underlying this issue did not make the same tragic error as Australian negotiators made many years ago in the Hong Kong-Australia Investment Treaty.
Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Why is it that the Australian federal government has stated publicly in April 2011 that it won't sign up to investor-state disputes provisions because, quote, these provisions would confer greater legal rights on foreign businesses than those available to domestic businesses, while the New Zealand government continues to go down this track?
The Honourable Tim Grosser.
Well, I can't speculate on what the members' ultimate political ambitions are, but my ambitions do not include speaking for the Australian government.
Dr. Russell Norman.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, Dr. Russell Norman. Order. Order. A point of order has been called, Dr. Russell Norman.
I just don't believe the Minister addressed the question.
The dilemma is, if I recollect the member's question correctly, asked the Minister why he thought the Australian government took a certain approach to investor protection clauses in agreements, and the Minister said in answer that he didn't pretend to be able to explain why the Australian government chose to do things, and that is an absolutely reasonable answer to the question. I think if the member thinks about it, and I'm very happy to check the transcript to make sure I'm not in error, but I think that's what the member will find. Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What position, if any, does the New Zealand government have on the Australian federal government refusing to accept investor-state dispute settlement provisions within the TPP?
The Honourable Tim Grosser.
Well, I have already answered that question in the previous supplementary, but let me just say for the House that this government, as I'm sure many other members of this House, stands solidly behind the Australian people and the Australian government in protecting themselves against what we think is an unwarranted claim.
Order. Now, this was a rather different question. This question asked how the New Zealand government would approach the TPP if the Australians refused to have an investment protection clause in the TPP agreement. That is something that does affect the New Zealand government. That is not an unreasonable question to be asked. I invite the Minister to answer it. The Honourable Tim Grosser.
Mr Speaker, the New Zealand Government will make up its own mind about what is in the balance of New Zealand interests when all the facts are on the table, and we are far from that point.
Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Will the government release the text of the TPP or release New Zealand's negotiating papers that it circulated to the other governments in the TPP negotiations prior to signing up to the TPP so that the New Zealand public can see what's in the agreement and can see the positions that the New Zealand government has taken in the negotiations?
The Honourable Tim Grosser.
Mr Speaker, no, and certainly not without the consent of our negotiating partners.
Question number 10, Sumaroni.
Of Education. Do any of the thousands of reports she refers